What does it take for us to take God seriously? What does it take in our lives for us to call out to God, to reach out to God? I remember in the weeks following 9/11, on that Sunday following the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers in New York City, churches across the U.S. had more people in them on that given Sunday than any Sunday prior for some time. Attendance was up for several weeks, but as we began to become more comfortable, as we began to feel a little more secure again, then we were less faithful or less inclined to see the need to go to church. Religious research has shown that people are often more open to making a change in their life. They're often more open to making a change that God would want them to make in their life, following a crisis. Think about your own spiritual walk. When have you become more fervent in calling out to God? Is it when you're facing a crisis, when you don't know which way to turn, or is it when you feel like you've got life by the tail and things are going just fine? The book of Daniel is an interesting book of the Bible. The first 6 chapters tell a number of neat stories that have been told in Sunday school. They're great children's stories, but also stories that speak to us as adults as well. But they're fun stories in the first 6 chapters, and then the last 6 chapters of Daniel are stories that are prophetic words. They're apocalyptic writings. Apocalyptic writings talk about the end times, talk about when Jesus is going to return. And those last 6 chapters of Daniel are much more difficult to digest and to understand theologically. Well, as Daniel begins, it begins when the prophet Daniel and some others are taken into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel would have been probably a young teenager at that point. But as we read throughout the book of Daniel, different events that are chronicled there are marked by who was king, and even what year that king was in his reign. And so historically we can look back and see how many years separated many of these events, many of these dreams, many of these prophecies. And we find that in Daniel it covers a span of probably 70 or 80 years. One of the things that's a little difficult about Daniel is that it's not written in chronological order. So you can't necessarily read it from beginning to end as it happened. The stories are not necessarily in the order that they happened in Daniel's life. And then all the prophecies, the apocalyptic words follow at the end. This morning, the story I want us to look at in the book of Daniel is found in Daniel chapter 5. Now, I don't know, this was never one of the more popular children's stories out of Daniel for me growing up, but I think it's a wonderful story of how God shows His faithfulness, how God shows that even where there seems to be no way, that His purposes can and will be accomplished. Up until this time, the stories in Daniel have all happened during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. But this story in chapter 5 is a story that took place during the time of the reign of King Belshazzar. Now, you may remember that King Nebuchadnezzar gave Daniel a different name. And Daniel's different name was Belteshazzar. It has a T in it. So don't confuse Daniel's given name as Belteshazzar along with this king's name who was Belshazzar. Now, several places in Daniel or in chapter 5, it refers to Nebuchadnezzar as being the father of Belshazzar, and on one occasion it refers to Belshazzar being the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And Belshazzar was not actually the biological son of Nebuchadnezzar, but because Nebuchadnezzar had been such an important figure in Babylonian history, and Belshazzar was in that line of successors, it was not uncommon to refer to Nebuchadnezzar as his father, or to refer to Belshazzar as Nebuchadnezzar's son. It would be similar to the way in our country we refer to our founding fathers, and that we are sons and daughters of our founding fathers. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had several experiences when he was confronted with the power of Daniel's God. It was that Nebuchadnezzar was actually one who worshipped idols, and promoted others to worship idols, but there were various times when he got in a crisis, and he called on Daniel, and Daniel called upon his God, and Daniel, in the name of the Lord his God, would share a message with Nebuchadnezzar, or would show the power of God, and Nebuchadnezzar would then praise Daniel's God, and he would tell others to worship Daniel's God. Now, I'm never sure how fully committed Nebuchadnezzar ever became to Daniel's God, but there were moments, there were periods in the history in which Nebuchadnezzar would let others know about Daniel's God. So Belshazzar would have heard about Daniel's God. Even though Belshazzar seems to have no remembrance of Daniel ever serving in Nebuchadnezzar's court, doesn't seem to have any recollection of how Daniel's God had worked, but there's indications in the story. The Belshazzar knew, and yet he chose to reject Daniel's God, and even thumb his nose at Daniel's God. Oh, King Belshazzar was putting on a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles, 1,000 of those who were under him. And as he was throwing that banquet, it was quite a feast. Maybe they had been drinking a little bit too much. Now, if you want to follow along in your Bibles in Daniel chapter 5, you can follow through on the story. I'm going to be reading some of the verses and also telling you some of the story. But in verse 2, it says, "While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and concubines, might drink from them." Now, back when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, he went in and raided the temple and took all their gold and silver goblets, anything of value that they could harvest from the temple, Nebuchadnezzar took back to put in his treasury. Now, that was something kings did. Whenever kings and armies went in and captured or conquered a people, anything of value they would take for themselves as spoils, as plunder, as a reward for their victory. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar had done. That's what kings do. But what I think is interesting about this whole story is that Nebuchadnezzar took the valuables out of the temple. But God had a different plan. Yet Nebuchadnezzar took the valuables out of the temple and put them in his treasury, and it was handed down to his successors. But eventually what happened was it was handed down to a successor that showed favor on the children of Israel, and gave them back the gold and silver out of the temple. So when the temple was rebuilt, actually it was refurbished with the very things that King Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple. Well, that's a part of the story that is on down the road. But at this point, these gold and silver goblets are in the treasury. They're in storage, and I don't know exactly what the mood of the party is at that point. But I'm thinking that King Belshazzar was probably making fun of Daniel and the Jews and their God. And he was pretty stuck on himself. He saw himself as being very powerful, very much in control, and was making fun of their God. Who was their God to him? And just to kind of show his power over their God, he said, "Go get the gold and silver goblets. Bring them in here. Let's use them out of their temple for us to have a party in this place."